I'm Mark Hennick. This is So-Called Normal. Hey folks, welcome to So-Called Normal. I'm Mark Hennick. Today on the show we have Al Levin. Al is a mental health advocate, a podcaster, a blogger, a coach, a public speaker. He's a vice principal in a school. His podcast is called The Depression Files, so go check that one out as well. He's just a really interesting guy, and I think we had a wonderful conversation and a deep conversation about his own experiences. Like so many of us, that's what drives him, I think, to do the work that he does, is his own personal experience with depression, with suicidal thoughts, and especially in his work in helping men to speak more openly about their depression and about their mental health. We get into a little bit around workplace mental health and what makes a good supportive workplace, and how he uses his own experience, hopefully, to help others that he works with too. So, I think I didn't know Al before we recorded this down in Dallas, Texas during the Health E-Voices conference. I think we did four episodes that we recorded down there. I hadn't heard of him prior to that, but I'm so glad that we met and that I got to know him a bit more. And I think you will be too. So here's my conversation on So-Called Normal with Al Levin.
So I am an educator. I work in St. Paul Public Schools as an administrator. I'm an assistant principal. And I have a wife and 4 kids.
4 kids.
4 kids. So the oldest is 13. The next one's about to turn 11. And then twins who are 7.
How's that?
It is chaos. It is continual chaos in our house, and I love it.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it's frustrating or annoying dealing with the relational things, the sibling battles, but it's a lot of fun. There's always something going on.
Did you always know that you're going to have a fairly, in terms of modern families, that's fairly big,
Yeah,
right?
It is fairly big. And so it was a real discussion for my wife and I. And, she has 2 sisters. I have a brother and sister. So after we had 2, we were like, maybe we should go for a third. Why didn't,
Right.
And so we convinced each other, and then we had twins.
Bam. That's a way for,
So
that's
from
a way
2
for,
to 4.
Yeah, for life to really, change.
Yeah. And throw in to that mix my first year ever promoted to a principal position, and thus you get depression.
All kinds of change. So, let's cut right to the point here. Tell me about that. How did that manifest for you?
So I was put into a new role. It was a new school. I didn't know any of the staff. I think a new principalship for anybody is stressful. For me, I felt like there was additional stress. I didn't know the staff at all. I walked into a budget cut of like $40,000. I had to already let people go before anybody even, before day one. I did not really, I love St. Paul Public Schools, so I certainly don't want to say anything negative, but I don't feel like I was supported as well as I could have been as a new principal.
Well, and that's actually pretty common in many workplaces. Workplaces are still trying to figure out how to do this, right?
Absolutely. And then throw on top of that, going home to a house that had, a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and 2 newborns was really challenging. And I rarely saw my kids. As a brand new principal, I left before they were awake, anybody. And then I'd get home for sure after dinner, and many times after bedtime. Right. And depression set in, and I could start to tell just my interactions with folks felt strange. And I started to have a knot in my stomach. I started struggling eating and getting food down. I started not being able to sleep. And so it became kind of a scary time.
Sure.
And I reached out to my brother, who's a family doctor in England, and he's living in England. And I was really lucky. He helped support me a lot. He talked me into going to my doctor's office. I still remember that first appointment. So it was probably October, right? The school year started in September. And in October, I walk into my doctor's office, and he knew me because I went for my yearly visits and whatnot. And he walked in, and I was pacing in this small, 4x4 room, just going back and forth, and I couldn't stop. And he looked at me and was like, "Whoa, Al, what's going on?" And I said, I don't really know, but this is what I'm in. Right. What's going on in my life. I don't know what's going on with me.
So you didn't know that you had depression. You just knew that something wasn't right.
Yeah. I mean, my brother had thrown out depression,
Right.
so it was on the radar, but I had never experienced any kind of depression prior to that.
Yeah.
And he started me on a medication right away and recommended a talk therapist for some therapy. And I remember getting back in my car and calling my mom, who was an educator as well and kind of a role model. And I called her and I was like, I might have to quit. I mean, I was 2 or 3 months into my new job, and my mom kind of convinced me to stick around, stick it out if I could. And my brother was, again, really instrumental, even with the medications, knowing that he realized from conversations with me just how much I was struggling and didn't want to miss work. So he helped support me by, medications often, as you know, take 4 to 6 weeks for any kind of impact or to get an antidepressant to a therapeutic level. So he talked to me about taking an additional medication, more of a Valium type of medication, in the midterm between the time of seeing the doctor until hopefully the antidepressant would start working. And he sent me to the doctor with an article to reference from JAMA, one of the medical journals that talked about that. And my doctor wasn't even available, but I just went in and saw somebody and shared with them the article and my thought. And right away they were on board and said, let's do it. So that was complicated and confusing for me too, going to work with Valium. You're like, whoa, this is kind of weird.
But it sounds like, though, I mean, for your brother to recommend that, for you to have those kinds of conversations with him, you mentioned your mom already, too, calling her. I don't think that's everybody's first instinct to call their family. Sometimes they would want to hide these issues from their family.
And it's interesting. So with my mom, I don't know if I think I must have shared with her about the medication. I don't really remember. My brother was a family doctor, therefore I really wanted to share with him. My second major bout of depression, I remember very clearly telling my brother and sister about it and saying, I don't want to burden my parents with this. I don't want them to know. But
was it something that you guys really talked about at all as kids growing up?
Never. And, I don't think we really had the experience of any kind of mental illness or depression in our family. So the topic never came up.
Was it ever implicitly or explicitly discouraged that you weren't allowed to talk about
no,
how
certainly
you were feeling
not.
or anything like that? No?
Yeah, it wasn't discouraged. I guess I just never had a situation where I was in such a deep, dark, low place. I think I'm kind of a closed person anyhow, so I probably didn't share a lot about my feelings with my family too much. But it wasn't something I wanted to hide. But like I said later on, I certainly didn't want to burden my parents. I felt like they had enough issues getting older and dealing with their own concerns that I didn't want to freak them out with my needs.
Yeah. How much of, if at all, did just being a guy play into this and all the stereotypes of what that means in terms of expressing your emotions?
I think being a man had a large part of it. And in my case, I think it was really challenging being a leader, knowing that I hire and fire people and being in that position when being in a state of depression, I was worried somebody might use it against me, and I was concerned about how I was performing. Luckily, with that bout of depression, I think my wife might disagree. I think I was able, with the medication and the talk therapy, to break through it, in a couple of months or so. But after 2 years in that position as a principal, I asked to voluntarily step down into an assistant principal role again. And that is what happened. And I left the principalship, I was switched to a different building because I work in a really large district. And I was put in as an assistant principal. My first year back as an assistant principal was fine. I usually get along with everybody I work with. The principal and I, it was a bit challenging just because of the dynamics. Her new boss had been my mentor when I was a principal, and her new boss also had been the principal of that very building before she was. So she really didn't have a lot of trust in me, I think, when really I had walked those shoes. She was probationary, and all I wanted to do was support her to get tenure in the district. But she ended up leaving after that year anyhow. So then I got a new principal. We hit it off right away in August or so when he started. And then come October, the day, almost 3 years to the day from my previous depression, I started to crash.
Really?
And I had a great review from my boss. My kids were getting older. Things were going well. I was getting along really well with my boss. Had a great first review. And all of a sudden I started crashing. My brother noticed the email date and said to me, like, it was almost 3 years to the day when I had reached out to him the last time. And I remember telling my brother and my best friend, like, I feel different right now.
Right.
And it really worries me.
Right.
Like, I think something is going on. I didn't even know how to describe it, but my entire body felt different.
Sure.
And
have you learned to identify if you have triggers for those kinds of experiences, or is it a cyclical thing? Or
well, it was really interesting. So that was 2013, my second bout, and I've been mentally healthy since then.
Right.
So I do think that I notice small triggers and things, and then I go to my tool belt and pull out every resource I have, and I'm still being treated.
Sure.
I still take a medication. I still go to a men's support group for depression and anxiety every other week.
Right.
But that second bout of depression, I always say, made my first depression feel like a walk in the park.
Really?
I mean, it was awful. And
how long did that one last?
So that one probably, all in all, I bet was about 6 months total. But it was a real major depression and was very debilitating.
Sure.
So again, it started in October. In November, I remember being at a friend of my wife's place for Thanksgiving. It was just another couple, and we were there with our 4 kids. And I sat at the kitchen island watching everything happen around me, and I was like a fly on the wall. I could not communicate with anybody at all. I was just sitting there, and everybody was moving around me. It was really an odd experience. And when I got home, and my wife and I had been talking since October for about a month that this was going on with me, and we were both like, that was awful. Like, and if that's what it looks like with friends, how are you able to survive at work?
Yeah.
So I decided to reach out to my boss that night and emailed him again. He was my new boss. I only knew him since August. And I said, I've got something important I want to talk to you about. Can we meet in a coffee shop?
Yeah.
And I just told him, like, I'm going through depression. He said, take the time off that you need and do what you need to get better. I support you. And he obviously supported me, because when I walked out of the coffee shop, the first thing he did was call my wife and say, Al told me he's going through depression. Know that he just left, so he should be home soon.
Right.
But that depression entailed all the same symptoms I mentioned, but there was a point where I was sleeping maybe 10 hours for the week. It impacted my cognition, my focus, my memory. I drove my daughter to a carpool that I had driven to many times, literally 3 blocks away, 2 turns, and I got all spun around and had to pull over with my daughter in the car to pull out my MapQuest to find this house that was 3 blocks away from us.
The disorientation and the difficulty focusing.
Yeah, it was just, it was really challenging. I had uncontrollable crying bouts where I would hold it together during the day, and I would just hold it together with my kids, and then I would just bawl. And when I took those days off with when my boss gave me that time off, I tried to readjust the meds, and I told my psychiatric PA, I'm starting to have suicidal thoughts, like general suicidal thoughts. Could it be the meds? Because as paradoxical as it is, we know about the black box warning, and some medications, antidepressants, can cause suicidal ideation. So I said, could this be the meds? Could this be my depression? And he said, yes.
Yeah.
It could be either. And he upped my dosage. And from that point, my depression, got worse. I tried to go back to work from a period between. There was a small gap of time where I would have about a week to do work and then have winter break. So I thought I would try to go back to work, but my suicidal ideations became a plan of suicide. I was doing some weird things too. I found myself, it was all like an out-of-body experience for me. I told my brother and my therapist, my wife, so many times, I just want to feel like myself. I found myself in the dark, sitting in a chair in my bedroom one day, and I had Googled suicide. And the first website I came to had a list of how to take your life, a scale of 1 to 10, how much pain it would cause, and how quickly you would die.
God. Yeah.
I read about somebody who took their own life with a gun and tried to, and the bullet went through one temple, out the other, and they survived. And so I found myself one day in front of the mirror without a real gun, thank God, but with my finger trying to figure out the angle that I would best use that at. And once I had this plan, really a plan of taking my own life, and I couldn't get it out of my head. I would push the thought out, and it would be there again. I'd push it out, and it was continually there. And one night I woke up dreaming of it, and woke up in the middle of the night. And the next morning I told my wife and sister, I need your help. I need your support. I need more help. Please come with me to the psychiatric PA to help advocate for me. And I was really lucky they did, because the psychiatric PA was still a little wishy-washy. You know, it could be tough taking time off. It could be stressful. Right. And they were like, he needs this. Yeah. So I got a letter from him, and I checked myself into a partial hospitalization program for 3 weeks. Wow. So that was in addition to the 10 days off of work I had just taken. This was 3 more weeks. And the way the partial hospitalization program works is you spend the evenings at your home, and then you go to the program from about 9 a.m. till 3 p.m. You know, there's a psychiatrist there who adjusts your meds, and there's our therapist there, and OT, occupational therapists, and different coursework and different pieces of learning and support groups. And it was a phenomenal, I always say it was a great kickstart to my recovery, but really I saw a therapist after that, and they said it would be a full year after a depressive episode like that, a full year until I would have a full recovery.
Not a lot of people realize how long of a haul it is, you know, that it takes a lot and a long time to get to that place very often. And sometimes we think that we can just get out of it overnight, and that's an unrealistic expectation. It takes a lot of work.
I always say it takes time and effort. I don't think people realize how debilitating depression can be. Yeah. And I think there's a false narrative of depression being sadness. Yeah. And a lot of times it's more like almost a numbness. Sure. And
I think a stuckness too. It's, absolutely. You can still experience other emotions, sure, but you, for some reason, get stuck in that pit, in that darkness. And it's, for me anyway, in my own experience with depression, that was more frustrating. It wasn't so much that I got sad, it was that I couldn't get out of that place. Right. And I felt stuck and trapped there.
Yeah. And when I look back on the 10 days I took off, I call them my unstructured days, because I wasn't in any intensive program or anything. And I would make a short list of, tomorrow I'm just going to clean one bathroom or do one load of laundry. And I couldn't do any of that. I couldn't get off the couch. If I did, it was usually I was like connected to my wife's hip and following her around, because I didn't even know what to do.
How'd she like that?
My goodness, she did not like that. And, she realized where I was at, and it was very fearful for her. I mean, anytime I left the house, she was worried that I wouldn't be coming back. Sure.
So she knew that you were suicidal?
She knew. I didn't share it immediately with her, but I also asked her to go to 1 or 2 of my appointments. And one time, they always ask if you've had thoughts, how often are they? And I remember very vividly, like, writing the number in there of how many times a day, and looking at her out of the corner of my eye, watching me and thinking like, oh, she doesn't know this. But some of the things I'd said to her, like, I urged her to go to therapy once I was better, and she did. Luckily, I had brought her to a therapy session with me, a couple, and she was like, wow, this is okay, hanging out on a couch and chatting with, a therapist. So she was up for it. And
so how did that impact your marriage, your experience at this time?
Boy, I am just so thankful that she stayed with me. I mean, I was unhelpful at the house. I felt, which just you beat yourself up more about as somebody in the midst of depression, knowing I am right now being an awful father. I'm being an awful spouse. I'm being an awful leader in a school where I'm supposed to be leading. And it could have been incredibly detrimental to our marriage. And I think that happens to many people who are suffering from depression. You know, the spouse can't handle it anymore and they leave. And I was trying to be empathetic towards her. I remember, you know, she had resigned from our district because we had the twins and a whole house full of little ones.
She's a teacher
5
too.
and under, and she's a teacher too. And but I told her, you know, I know some of your close friends are in the school district. I don't mind if, like, I'm not sharing this with anybody. And I was very, you know, I think very, I can't even think, shame. You know, I had a lot of shame about it, and I wasn't sharing it with anybody. And I wanted, you know, I didn't tell anybody why I was leaving work, but I told her, you know, I know you've got close friends in the district. You can share because you need to tell people what you're going through living with me. And I know it was tough for her.
And what about your kids too? Have you been open with them about your experiences?
So that's a great question. So my oldest two, who are 13 and 11 this Sunday, I shared a lot with my 13-year-old. I have shared more now with my 11-year-old, and the twins I haven't said anything yet because they're 7.
Sure.
I plan on being very open with all of them. The one piece I have not shared, even with the 13-year-old yet, is the suicidal ideations I had. She doesn't need to hear that, but I do want them to know how bad it can get, and that it's really important to always be open about your feelings and share your feelings. And I know, you know, as an educator, how tough it can be for kids and how many children go through depression these days and all the bullying. And, you know, when I was a kid, if you were bullied, you go home, you hang out with your neighborhood friends, your family. Nowadays, kids hit the social media and the bullying is 24 hours a day for some kids.
And even more than just you as an educator, I mean, you as a parent, do you feel better equipped now, or maybe you haven't even thought about this, that if or when they come to you and tell you, Dad, I'm really having a hard time?
Yes.
Right?
I have thought plenty about that. In fact, my first thoughts were, crap, I know about the hereditary factor, and I don't want to be the one who gives this to my kids. My second thought was, I am going to make sure I equip them as much as possible to prepare if something like this does happen, and hopefully give them tools to prevent it from ever happening. But you know, with no matter how many tools and how well you use them, anybody can be susceptible to depression. So I want them to know about being open, talking. We already had my second oldest meeting with a therapist who she loves just because she is a kid. She's adorable and everybody loves her. And she would have meltdowns in the house and her feelings were gigantic, whether she was super excited or super angry. And so we had her meet with the same person who my wife had seen when I urged her to go. And she loved it. And now I'm really glad that that's an open conversation in our house too. Like, hey, you need to go talk to somebody, let's do it. And I'm really excited that that's open to my kids. They're open to it. They have enjoyed that experience. And I think that's a big piece.
That's great. So when you did the partial hospitalization, and then eventually, it sounds like left that program or finished that program and then went on to other supports.
Yep.
When did it really start to click, if it has, that you're doing okay, that you're doing better, that you seem to be in recovery, whatever that means?
Yeah. So, you know, it took a while. My boss was really understanding, and I told him right when I came back. I asked to meet with him again at a coffee shop before coming back a few days before, and I told him what a therapist said. You know, it's going to take me a year to fully recover. But I think he also trusted me. I told him I wouldn't come back if I wasn't ready. But it was difficult, and it's tough to say for sure how much and how quickly I recovered. I feel even like I'm still getting stronger and better sometimes to this day. So that is tough to say, but my boss was kind of like, you should share your story with the staff. And a term I love that I learned in the support group from one of the guys who was facilitating it was the term of raw. And I told him, it's way too raw. Like, I will share with staff when the time is right. And then probably like 2 years out from my depression, I started to feel like I do want to share my story. And I started a blog where I started writing all about my story. And then I tried to Google it and realized I can't even Google and find so I'm trying to become a little more public. I can't even find my blog on my own.
Yeah.
So then I created a Twitter account, and it was interesting because I was already tweeting for school. And then when I created a new account, it was really interesting because it was clear that my account was about depression and so forth and driving people to my blog. And within 30 seconds, 2 staff from my school were following me, but still nobody really talked about it.
Right.
And I'm not sure if you know what it's like to work in a school. If one person finds out, things spread like wildfire.
It's like a small town.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So I'm sure people knew. And then it was funny because I love sharing this story because I think it speaks to the stigma and how people still are quiet about it or whisper about it, right? So I have one staff member in the school who she would come into my office and she'd walk to the way back and she'd whisper to me, "I saw your most recent post." And I was kind of like, that's okay. You can say that a little louder. Like I'm sharing.
Yeah. So did you notice after you did start to open up, at work, other people coming up to you and still maybe haven't disclosed, but wanted to tell you that they'd been there too?
So now I've been doing advocacy for, probably 2.5 years. And now I think I'm out there on media a lot more, and it's a lot easier to find me. I've finally reached over 10,000 followers on Twitter. Yeah. I have a podcast and so forth. So while I'm still not in the face of everybody, because I don't want to do that and be hey, I'm the mental health guy.
No, sure.
But people definitely, I've noticed, are coming up to me more frequently, staff members, to say, "I need a mental health day," or "I got to leave 20 minutes. My kid's in therapy. Can I leave 20 minutes early?"
Right.
So the conversations, and I think that's really important as a leader, to be open to the conversations and to allow for it so that people are comfortable and don't have to hide it. I think a lot of educators and many in any field struggle with depression, and there is a lot of shame around it. And sometimes I think that's due to the stigma in the community still that causes self-shame, which makes it so people don't want to reach out. Some research shows that people live for 10 years before seeking help. And it's just, we got to change that. And I think being a leader in a school or a school district helps to talk about that.
Do you think that your experience with depression, with suicidal ideation, your treatment and ongoing recovery, has that made you a better leader, a better educator?
I think it definitely has. I think it's made me be more empathetic. I think I have such a better understanding of mental illness. I'm ashamed to say what my stereotypes were of mental illness.
Sure,
I think it was,
I
think my image was definitely somebody on the streets, looking like they hadn't showered for months and begging for money. And that was my stereotypical image. And I want to make sure others don't have that image and others can see me as a productive leader, having had depression and still being able to lead and being more empathetic for people. I sometimes when I know a parent shares with me that they're going through a challenging time, I'm open to say, I've been there, and I've even been in a hospitalization program. So I get what's going on, and let me connect you with our social worker who can't give you services, but can certainly direct you to the right resources. Yeah. So I feel like there's definitely, I think I've always had quite a bit of empathy, but now a much greater sense of empathy and understanding that what people go through.
Yeah. And has your workplace changed over that time as well? Have they started instituting more mentally healthy practices?
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know. I think I credit my boss with a lot of that, Dr. Bass, with a lot of what he's brought into the school. And I like to think that part of it was his experience in dealing with me. I don't think he had ever dealt with somebody directly who was going through depression. And he was a huge supporter and advocate for me. And some of it was ongoing work, but he deepened it. We've had staff go through trauma training so that we can become more trauma-informed staff. We've brought mindfulness and yoga calm into our schools. Great. And so there's a lot we're doing. And actually, I reached out and got a $500 grant from Health Partners, and I created a self-care room for our staff. Nice. Because I think, everybody knows about the needs of our kids, and there is enormous need needs, but at least people are aware of the mental health needs of our students and are talking about it, working on it. I don't think anybody talks about the needs of our staff, and I think there is immense needs.
Well, especially among educators. I mean, often poorly paid, people doing it because they're passionate, paying out of pocket sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
Taking on all kinds of other people's stuff, their kids,
The stress,
people
the stress of test scores, and we are dealing, particularly in a large urban district, with kids who are going in and out of complex trauma on a daily basis. And there are implications to our mental health and our wellness from secondary trauma, which is a real thing. And when we have kids who we hear their situations and we take that on, it wears us down. So,
what have educators that you've worked with been telling you in terms of what they need from their workplace in order to be happier and healthier?
That's a great question. So I haven't really tapped into the school or district that I'm at, but I did have a survey out on Twitter. I would tweet it out. It was just a Google form, and I didn't go through any of the proper channels for real research, but I wanted a general sweeping idea. And, I think most shared some incredibly compelling stories about being educators and the stress and the depression and the medications and the therapy that they need because of what they've experienced. I am still exploring how to best support teachers and educators. So I have a lot of ideas, and I'm actually doing some partnership with Health Partners, who provides our health plan in our district, to do some literary reviews around what are large organizations or school districts doing to support staff. I just know we can do a much better idea. I think it would be great if we're a large enough school district. I think we should have support groups, a support group for our social workers, a support group for our school counselors, a support group for our high school teachers, our elementary teachers, our administrators. I think we could all use the support groups, and I think to try to get people to talk more about it. 2 years ago, at the beginning of the school year, I got to stand up in front of all of our assistant principals, assistant soups, and share my story and talk about depression.
Oh, wow. And what was the response to that like?
Well, it was amazing. I think it was the first time anybody at the admin level had shared with colleagues about their own story of depression. And I got a standing ovation, and several people pulled me aside, one with tears in their eyes, privately saying, "You just told my story." I mean, I think there are people out there who need support and aren't getting it and are scared to ask for it. Particularly, I think in leadership positions, it's tough to share.
Well, why do you think they are so hesitant to share as leaders? Does it make them less of a leader?
That's a great question. I'm not sure, and I think maybe it has to do with the stigma. Maybe it has to do with people questioning their strength, their stamina, if they've succumbed to a mental illness. But I don't think there should be. I think a principal would be comfortable saying, "I need time off. I have cancer."
Sure.
I don't think they would be comfortable, most, saying, I have to take time off. I'm dealing with depression. Yeah. And, most of it is probably our internal fears, but some of it could be reality, right? I don't, like I mentioned, I'm hiring and firing staff, right? And could they use that against me? Right. I don't know. So maybe
I think it is often a mix of both, right? Sometimes we're afraid of things that often we're afraid of things that may never happen, that may not match up to reality. But then again, we see stats that people tend to get passed over for promotion, for example, or sometimes fired because they're dealing with a mental illness. So
absolutely.
I think there's
discrimination.
There's enough of those horror stories out there, I think, that we grab onto them.
Yeah.
Right?
I think you're right.
So how do we create a safer workplace then, where we can let people know that, no, we're going to try our best to do this right?
So that's one of my goals, right? And that's why I've shared with administrators in our district. That's why I've shared with staff, because I think the more we're open to talk about it, the more we diminish the stigma, the more we're able to share our stories and talk about it and support one another and say, "Hey, I get it. I've been there. Why don't you take a few days off? We're going to be here when you get back. Take a week if you need a week, 2 weeks, what you need, and we're going to be here for you, and we're going to support you." That, I think, is mostly a huge piece of what we need, so that people are willing to share and don't hold it inside of them and struggle and put on that mask of I'm fine.
That's it. And it impacts their performance, I think, in every way. So administrators of any workplace need to appreciate that if their interest really is in either their bottom line or the outcomes that they're targeting, then they want to take care of their people, because those are the people who are driving those outcomes.
Absolutely.
And when I think back on my troubled childhood, when I dealt with all of my own, or when many of my own struggles first started, now, I think about the people who were most influential to me at that time, and they were almost all teachers, because those are the people that I spent more of my waking hours with than anybody else.
Right.
So if they're not mentally healthy, and even more important, or equally importantly, I should say, if they don't have the skills that they need to help me navigate this time of my life, that's going to have a big long-term impact on me.
Absolutely.
Right?
And, I always say, if you don't take care of yourself, you cannot take care of others.
That's right.
Obviously, I'm not the only one saying that, but I completely
It's
agree
so
with
true.
it. Yeah. And we have to look out for ourselves and do the self-care, take care of one another if we want to be there for the kids. If we are putting on a mask of I'm okay and struggling internally, somebody described it as just like a cesspool of mental illness, right?
Well, and then it becomes that old adage, those who can't do, teach, right? And I think we want to steer clear of that.
Yeah,
so
please.
Ideally, we have people who are teachers who are modeling the kind of skills that we need kids to learn, how to identify and name and label their emotions, and then how to actually manage them and work through them. Well, it's hard to learn from somebody who doesn't know how to do it themselves.
Yeah.
How are you on that front, actually? Are there ways in which you're including mental health literacy in your curriculum, either district-wide or this podcast is based in Canada, so are there trends in America that are including better mental health literacy in schools?
So by mental health literacy, are you talking about for the students?
Well, actually, I think you could apply it to both. I was originally thinking for the students, but for everybody, just basic awareness of some facts about mental health.
So thanks to NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, there have been new requirements for continuing education clock hours.
Really? Okay.
And the most recent one was just implemented as of last year, which is suicide awareness.
Wow.
And so they are having staff understand some of the signs and symptoms of depression and other mental illnesses, and understand how to handle them, and not to try to provide therapy or something, but to recognize it and know when to go to a social worker or an administrator with their concerns. Yeah. So it's becoming much more on the radar of teachers, and that, I think, is huge. And then, like I said, I think there is a trend towards what we're doing, which is becoming more trauma-informed.
Sure.
And getting teachers to understand how to work with kids who have experienced trauma is incredibly essential in working with the kids who have dealt with trauma in their lives. And it's awesome practice for dealing with any kid. Yeah. And it's really important stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and trauma in particular is so prevalent, and that means a lot of different things to different people. But working in an environment like that, and especially with people who either may have secondary trauma themselves or direct trauma themselves, when those things bump into each other in the workplace, two traumatized people who haven't processed that can be an explosive situation, and that happens all the time. Yeah. So it helps to have people educated on how to manage that, I think.
Absolutely. And I have certainly engaged in conversations with teachers around their own challenges that they've talked about or they'll hint at. And, I'll ask, did you ever work through that trauma? Like, that's important. And then I talk about different therapies that I'm aware of now, mostly through the work I've done as an advocate, and share with them resources and thoughts, and, tell them, go home and Google it, check it out, do some reading about it, or tell them the title of a book. And things like that.
And there's so many resources out there that if one thing isn't right, if medication isn't right for you, or if therapy isn't right for you, or whatever, there's all kinds of different routes and you really do have to figure out what's best for you. And it's a little bit different for everybody, it seems.
Absolutely. And then, one of the ways I'm learning a ton, I think I told you, through my advocacy work, we are here right now at a conference, Healthy Voices, put on by Jansen.
But we do not represent the views of Jansen.
My views are my own, but Jansen is paying for us to stay and to fly to this incredible conference where I get to meet incredible people like you, other online advocates of chronic illness. And I left there after 2 years ago after being at the conference, and started to create a podcast.
So tell me about the podcast. I want to dig into this a bit. What is it? What do you do?
I'm really excited about it. It's been going for 1.5 years strong. All I do is I interview men who have been through depression.
Okay.
And it's really interesting. I mean, the first thing I did was I reached out to another advocate and was, emailing with him, and I said, I know you have bipolar disorder. My show is about depression, so I don't think I'll have you on there. And then I realized, like, my first 5 guests, I mean, most of the guys I have on are not exclusively dealing with depression.
Sure, no.
So I am learning so much about bipolar 1, bipolar 2, schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia, and it's been amazing. And the whole idea is get guys sharing their stories, talking about depression. So I want it to support people who may be going through depression. I want to educate those who don't know much about depression and let them understand how debilitating it can be, and to help chip away at the stigma.
Yeah.
And I think the more we share our stories, the more we're able to talk about it.
We reclaim the stories then, and it gives us power, I think.
So I interview men, and originally...
Why men?
I think you kind of touched on it a little earlier. I do think there is a gender impact. I think depression hits all, but men have, there's the macho piece about men, and there is this piece where men aren't as comfortable talking about their feelings and their emotions. So they tend to bury it. Not that all women are open about it, but they tend to bury it more, not talk about it. They're the ones who feel like they got to buck up. A lot of kids, boys are told when they're young, don't cry, right? So they're kind of trained to hold those emotions in. And so I really wanted a voice for men. And I think the more men hear other men talking about it, the more comfortable others get. And I think that's really important. More women attempt suicide, but 3 times the number of men end up losing their lives by suicide. Typically because they choose a more lethal means. But
and men are, like you say, burying all these emotions until, I think it was Freud that said you can't just push that stuff down forever. It's going to come out in other ways.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? And it's coming out for men in suicide.
Absolutely. And another reason I wanted to do the podcast was I just think, when I saw the statistics around suicide, it blew my mind. And I was wondering why it's not like a national level conversation on a regular basis, because so the most recent data that I've had my hands on is that there is suicide every 11.1 minutes. And in that 11.1 minutes, there are 25 attempts. So if you do the math, there's an attempt every 26.6 seconds in the U.S. An attempt every 26.6 seconds.
And I think in the States, I think it's in the States, you're losing 45,000 people a year to suicide.
Yeah,
right?
it's I think 47,000 is the latest number. And those numbers just keep increasing. Where I live in the Twin City metro area, the most recent data shows that male suicides in the past 2 years has increased by 18%. We need to be talking about it. So I didn't want to sit on my haunches and just complain about it. I wanted to, my blog has kind of taken a hit while I've been doing the podcast. I started it. It's funny in my basement where I still
as many podcasts start, and many great endeavors start in somebody's basement.
It's in my basement. I started grabbing guys from the support group I was at, and there are other support groups through this foundation. So I started emailing all the guys who led the groups and said what I was doing. And it's funny because, they'd come and knock on my door at night, and my 2 oldest kids would be up, and they'd look at me and be like, "Another strange man coming, Dad?" I'd be like, "Yeah, sorry, guys." Because often I hadn't even met them because they were from a different group. I'd interview them in the basement. I was concerned about time. So I started stockpiling interviews. And I had about 8 before I ever launched. And I had one beautifully edited. Well, as beautiful as I can do. And
we're all just figuring this out.
Exactly. And then it ended up that, there's this piece, the negative talk, where I was like, I don't know if I launch this, it becomes public and people might not like it, and a little scary, right? So I had this stockpile and I just kept building on it. And then in September, it was World Suicide Prevention and Awareness Day. And I was like, whoa, if there's a day to launch a podcast like this is the day. So I launched, and then I decided to publish every other Sunday to give me some time so that it wasn't a mad, crazy rush with a full-time job, 4 kids. And it's time consuming. I love the podcast work, and I've learned so much from it, and it's time consuming. But so I've been doing every other Sunday I publish, and it's a different man. I try to get all walks of life. I've tried to make sure I have Black men on it, because I think the stigma is even tougher in the Black male community. I've tried to get, I have an an emergency room surgeon on it who spent 3 months in an inpatient program. I have some other advocates, one advocate who had lost 2 brothers, his only 2 brothers, to suicide. I have an advocate who was abusing alcohol and became an alcoholic because of his depression, and woke up in the hospital one day finding out that he had passed out driving and took someone's life. And he's out there advocating now. So I try to get a wide variety. I've got some authors and some therapists on the show, but always the requirement is that it's a man and that they have been through depression. I'd love to expand, and I have the idea of when on like an off Sunday, publishing an episode that is more like somebody who deals with men with depression. So maybe a therapist who works exclusively with men, maybe a spouse of a man with depression, different things like that. And I do have one that I did publish as like a bonus episode, I called it. And that was a guy who in England created the Lions Barber Collective. And he created a collective of barbershops who are open about mental health. And they aren't therapists, but he talked about how they connect intimately with men instantly. Men see them as their barber more frequently than they see the family doctor. And they oftentimes learn things like, the guy's going to be proposing to a woman next week before anybody else knows. So they kind of post that, we're open to conversations around mental illness, mental health. And he's getting barbers trained. And it was just really cool. I read an article about him. So I've got an episode about him as
Amazing stories.
It really is.
And that's I think the power of what you do, what I'm trying to do with the show, is that sharing those kinds of stories matters, that it makes people feel not so alone. And you hear this all the time, how it's the most particular stories that have the most universal impact, right?
Absolutely.
That sometimes we think that this happened to me and only me and nobody's ever been through this before. Well, actually, no, it turns out it's quite the opposite, that you're not alone.
Absolutely. And that's why I really love support groups too. You get to see people who have experienced something you've experienced, get tidbits and tips and things. In fact, that was funny. Before I checked myself into a partial hospitalization program, one thing I share with people about how difficult it can be to reach out to somebody. My best friend told me when my depression was at its worst, my second bout, he said, "Hey, Al, I've got this buddy. All he does is deal with men with depression." My first comment was kind of a joke, as much as I could have joked at the time. Like, you've been holding out on me, dude? You know a man who all he does is deal with men and depression, and now you're telling me? And it took me 3 weeks to reach out to that guy. And each week I'd text my friend and say, dude, let him know I'm going to call him. Like he needs a warning, right? Some depressed guy is going to call him. It took me 3 weeks. I finally reached out to him. I met him a couple times. Great guy. FaceItFoundation.org in Minneapolis in the Twin Cities. They're just local, provide services to men for free. Met with him a couple times, and he talked me into going to a support group, and I haven't stopped yet. But I remember I went to the support group the day before I started my partial hospitalization program because I wanted to have some kind of support when I got out. I was thinking about that in advance, which was pretty wise, actually. But I walked into that door and I cried for 2 hours straight in front of about 8 men I had never met and didn't want to leave that room. It was like instant feeling of I'm safe. I'm around people who get it. And then, I think at the end I was like, is this confidential? I hope this is confidential. And I had no idea where they were on their depression. They could all have been really healthy, and I just remember one of them just going, "Oh, you're deep in the shit." I was bad. Like a year later, a few months later, they were rehashing that, and one guy said, "Do you think we should have called 911?" And a few people were like, "Yeah, absolutely." But there's the guy who runs it. He knows, and he knew I was going into a program the next day. But and a lot of guys say walking through that door was the toughest thing I've ever done, and for me, that was the easiest. I was like, a bunch of guys who are going to get me and understand this, and I can share.
Yeah. So really for somebody who might be listening to this, especially a guy, but anybody, but especially a guy who's either suspects that he has depression or is newly diagnosed and hasn't even really gone very far down the road to recovery yet, what do you want him to know?
I think the most important thing is reach out for help. It's not a weakness. Don't let any kind of stigma or fear prevent you from reaching out. It's so much better than any of the alternatives. And find somebody you trust that you can reach out to, whether it's a family member or a close colleague or a neighbor who you trust. And if not them, then a professional. Go to your family doctor, call a suicide hotline, but reach out for help. And it's okay. And you can get better. You can get better.
Yeah. Al, this has been fun.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Where can people, what's the podcast called? Where can people find you?
Great question. So everything of mine can be found at thedepressionfiles.com. Thedepressionfiles.com. At the top is a button for my podcast, which is just thedepressionfiles.com/podcast, but it's on that site. My blog is there. I've got a button for my story, a short version, and then the details, so they can get everything there.
That's great. Well, I hope everybody does, and I expect they will. You're awesome.
I hope so.
Thanks for talking to me.
All right. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, that's my conversation with Al Levin, the mental health advocate, podcaster, blogger. Go check out his podcast, The Depression Files, on Apple Podcast. Check out ours too, please, while you're there. While you're over at Apple Podcast, look up So-Called Normal. Subscribe to both our shows, The Depression Files and So-Called Normal. Leave us some comments, some ratings. I think you'll really enjoy the episodes we have to come. If you haven't listened to the episodes in the past, go back and listen to those as well. I've spent some time catching up on Al's show, and I think that the more of these kinds of conversations we can have out in the public space, the better, especially around workplace too. And it really stuck with me, the conversation that Al and I had around having a supportive workplace and how he could go to his boss and talk about these kinds of things. And, while we don't always understand, or employers don't always understand how to help people, just that openness, that willingness to be able to help the person find out what to do next and to be able to give them some flexibility to figure out their situation in a way that works for them, that can make all the difference. So we need to be able to get that message out there more, that recovery is not only possible, it's actually likely when people get the help that they need from the vast majority of these kinds of struggles. So I mentioned Apple Podcast already, but I'll mention it again. Head over there and subscribe to the show, to So-Called Normal. You can check me out on social media as well. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and everywhere else at Mark Hennick, at MarkHenick. You can also go to my website, markhennick.com. If you want to try out some free psychotherapy, a free trial of psychotherapy, go to BetterHelp, betterhelp.com/Mark. Enter the promo code Mark, and you can get connected with some well-credentialed, educated, screened psychologists psychotherapists who know what they're doing just to go try it out. You never know. One of these things, every time I go back for some tune-up psychotherapy, which is, every now and then, sometimes I need it more than other times, but I always make a point of going back. I always interview a couple of psychotherapists to see who sticks, who feels right. Just because you've had 1 or 2 or 10 bad experiences with psychotherapists doesn't mean they're all bad. In fact, most of them are very good. So sometimes that takes a bit of practice to find out the person that works for you. And if you want to try that out on this free trial of BetterHelp, that's what you can use it for. BetterHelp.com/Mark. Enter the promo code Mark. I want to thank the whole team here at Entertainment One for bringing the show together. Adrian, Kimberly, Allison, my editor, Dave Trafford, everybody who has come together as a team to make this show work. It wouldn't be possible without them. That's it for me. Tune in next Monday. We've got another amazing guest. I think all of our guests are amazing, but next week as well, you'll want to tune in for that one. I'm Mark Hennick, and this has been So-Called Normal.